All right, Bill, welcome back to the Gnostic Media Podcast for your 7th time back now, and this is part 2 on NVC and its relation to the trivium method. What are we titling this specifically? No, I forget. I think we had come up with one title last night, Nonviolent Communication from the Fabians through MKULTRA to today.
Yeah.
That is probably more applicable to this episode than the last one. So,
Yeah.
Anyway, Bill, I'll hand it over to you, and I think we're starting on image 36.
Yeah. So this is going to be NVC, a deeper look. So what I want to focus on now is NVC as a tool. It's a certain technology. So I want to look at really how this works. So now we're talking about how linguistics and ideas and so on affect thinking, and how NVC fits into that context, which is deeply rooted in with the history of NVC, both in how it operates, but also in what it's specifically addressing in terms of world events or whatever. So there is an idea floating around in academia that linguistics is primary to consciousness. We're not able to have more elaborate thinking unless we're able to speak. And at some level, that's true. We can communicate to a certain level, and our thinking will only go so long until we can start communicating with each other. When we can externalize our ideas through thoughts, that allows us to start moving into more and more abstractions. But to take the idea that reality begins with linguistics, which then dictates the structure of society, which then affects the consciousness of the individual, which then creates an individual's reality, is this idea of a stolen concept again.
So you're basically, to put it into context for a lot of people, it's like Terence McKenna's favorite quote, "If you know the words that the world is made of, you can make of the world what you wish."
The secret of magic is that the world is made of words, and that if you know the words that the world is made of, you can make of it whatever you wish.
Right, and I've heard other people say that, for instance, unless you have a word for something, it doesn't exist for you. And I say that's not true. Like if there's a tree out there, you might not be able to articulate that, you might not have any language, but you're not going to run into it. You know that the object's there. The depth of clarity or the depth of detail and nuance that you have around the concept of tree won't be there unless there's language there.
Now, let me just interject in an idea right here, because let's say you're in China and you don't speak Chinese, you speak English, and you can't formulate the word for tree in China. And so, but the tree would still exist. So let's say that somebody who, for lack of better terms, is a simpleton, they speak blah, 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 maybe they go, tree, or
tree,
thing, but they can point to it, they know it's there even if they can't articulate the word for it. So
that's right.
It doesn't make the tree suddenly not exist, even if our English would be Chinese to the simpleton, for instance, right?
That's right, and this is something that's prevalent around the basis behind, say, social constructivism, that we are really the result of our interactions in society, and this has its foundation in linguistics, in cybernetics back in the 60s, and actually cybernetics and a lot of NLP was actually drawn off Chomsky's work with linguistics. But it's this idea, again, of taking a higher order concept, linguistics, placing it as an axiom, and then rebuilding your concepts that way. It's a misintegration of information again. Now, I'm not saying that that doesn't mean that linguistics isn't a foundation for higher order concepts. That is the case, and it doesn't mean that we're not affected by society and so on. But society doesn't define who I am. Society has an impact on that. Language doesn't define who I am, or language in my head doesn't define who I am, but it has an impact on it. So it's about ordering these things in the proper order. So the first thing I want to touch on is this idea behind linguistics. And this ties right back, again, to Bateson with cybernetics. Okay, this idea.
And let me just add that we've exposed recently, and Joe Atwill has uncovered that Gregory Bateson was a key figure in the creation and founding of the CIA, and he was brought in by General William Wild Bill Donovan to present the reason as to why the OSS should be converted into the CIA and kept post-war.
He's also the one that started the conferences on mind with Newman.
And he was also at all of the Macy Foundation conferences, or many of them, which were related to MKULTRA, and many of the conferences there were Control of the Mind was the title.
Okay, that's it. And also Esalen. He was all over Esalen
right,
as well.
he was absolutely one of the key people at Esalen, and he's also the one that we've exposed that came up with the double bind that you exposed in your first episode with me on meditation, which will be linked in the show notes for this. And he also came up with native revivalism that Joe Atwill and I exposed in the Grateful Dead article, which ties into the archaic revival.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's who we're dealing with.
Right.
So linguistics. Understanding the impact on linguistics on cognition is key to understanding the mechanics behind NVC, NLP, Delphi, etc. The idea is that social interaction impacts on how an individual frames reality. So this is cybernetics right there. Perception of reality can only occur through the development of language. Language cannot develop until it is externalized or spoken to others. And they externalize their thoughts back to us. So we externalize them to them, they externalize it back to us, social interaction. This interaction then frames how reality is constructed in our own minds. So reality is therefore created out of dominant social frames, consensus of population or popular narrative, which is built upon language. So this is the whole idea that how you are aware and what you're aware of in the world is a product of culture. Okay.
And what you're saying right there also, by consensus of the population or popular narrative, that goes back to what I said in the last episode about it. Their claim is essentially that everything that you know is based on an appeal to popularity and not the facts themselves,
or an appeal to authority.
Right, and whereas in reality, anyone can verify things on their own and step out of the consensus or popular narrative.
Right. Okay, so I got a small syllogism here. Primacy of linguistics creates society. Society then creates consciousness. Consciousness then creates reality. So again, it's this Platonic idea that the abstract is really what's dictating the concretes of reality. So therefore, reality is created out of social narrative. Change the narrative, change reality. This is what they're up to. Change the narrative, change reality. Okay, so I'm going to go on to 37. Milton Erickson. Now, Erickson was a psychologist that created the brief, called brief therapy. He used essentially covert hypnosis in therapy. He mastered this technique. Through Bateson, he was introduced to, is it Bandler and Grindler from NLP?
Bandler and Grinder.
And was also associated with Rogers.
Right. He heavily influenced Bandler and Grinder, and I'll show this from the brain database in the final cut. And then he's also associated with several key MKUltra players. Again, we already mentioned Gregory Bateson. but he also ties directly to Carl Rogers, who is, let's see, MKUltra Subproject 97. And then he also ties directly to Aldous Huxley, who is one of the key architects behind MKUltra.
Right. So we're going to go through some of the techniques that Erickson had created. So the first one we're going to address here is called indirect technique. And all of this can be found on Wiki under Erickson.
And it's also in the brain database.
Yeah. So where classical hypnosis is authoritative and direct and often encounters resistance in the subject, Erickson's approach is permissive, accommodating, and indirect. Sound familiar? For example, where a classical hypnotist might say, "You are going into a trance," an Ericksonian hypnotist is more likely to say, "You can comfortably learn how to go into a trance." Remember we were talking about switching the language of obligation to the language of choice? We've just found that rewording. We're going from an imperative, "You are going into a trance," into a request. You can comfortably learn how to go into a trance. Okay? Because the induction takes place during the course of a normal conversation, Ericksonian hypnosis is often known as covert or conversational hypnosis. In other words, the subject doesn't know they're being hypnotized. Erickson maintained that it was not possible consciously to instruct the unconscious mind, and that authoritarian suggestions were likely to be met with resistance. The unconscious mind responds to openings, opportunities, metaphors, symbols, and contradictions. Effective hypnotic suggestion, then, should be artfully vague. So again, we're talking about these definitions in NVC are stepping away from clarity and into ambiguity. They're artfully vague. This leaves space for the subject to fill in the gaps with their own unconscious understanding, even if they do not consciously grasp what is happening. Okay, so this lines up directly with how NVC is operating.
Now, I do want to interject here that the reason why we're discussing Milton Erickson in relation to NVC is he heavily influenced, as we just said, John Grinder and Richard Bandler. And those two, along with Dr. Carl Rogers, etc., created neurolinguistic programming, And so neurolinguistic programming was then modified again and comes out as nonviolent communication.
Right, and Rogers influenced Rosenberg, and Rogers also created what's called patient-centered therapy, which was based on Erickson's brief therapy. So we have direct connections here.
Sure. Well, he didn't just influence Rogers. He was actually, Rogers didn't just influence Rosenberg. He was actually Rosenberg's professor.
So there we go. So now I'll go on to slide, this is 38. The effective linguistics on cognition, Milton Erickson. The language of choice, a modification of prepositional language to less authoritative, falls into this category of an indirect technique. By softening one's position to avoid the language of obligation, two things occur. The statements become artfully vague. The NVC are stepping away from a definitive stance, obfuscating what the position actually is. This leaves the listener to then search for their position. Where do they really stand on this? What are they really saying? Essentially it creates an opening or a void that draws the listener in. So if I'm artfully vague with you on my position, you have to kind of take a step forward and reconstruct what you're hearing and try to get into my head to understand what my position is before I can form my next comment. So this drawing a person in is a subtle form of hypnosis. And it's at that moment when a person is searching for that position that it creates a gap where suggestibility is heightened. So rewording to avoid authoritative language removes resistance in the listener. It soothes the person into a more receptive state, essentially dropping their guard. It's a means of manipulating the context in which a statement is made without changing the content. It is to change the content into a hypnotic suggestion. So by teaching people to reword themselves into giraffe language to avoid jackal language, is getting them to adopt an indirect technique of subverting a person's conscious processing. Okay.
All right, and 39.
So 39, another technique of Erickson's is called the confusion technique. And he says, in all of my techniques, almost all, there is confusion. A confused person has their conscious mind busy and occupied. It is very much inclined to draw upon unconscious learning to make sense of things. A confused person is in a trance of their own making, and therefore goes readily into that trance without resistance. Confusion might be created by ambiguous words, complex or endless sentences, think of the definitions, pattern interruption, which is throwing in phrases that you would anticipate what the next word is and then change that one word. It's a pattern interruption. Or a myriad of other techniques to incite what's called transderivational searches. So this is that idea of drawing in and having to search for context to understand what the person's saying. Long and frequent use of the confusion technique has many times affected exceedingly rapid hypnotic inductions under unfavorable conditions such as acute pain and terminal malignant disease, and in persons interested but hostile, aggressive, and resistant. So NVC is a technique about dropping the other person's resistance.
All right.
Without their consent. That's the key word here, is without their consent.
And now we're at number 40.
Okay. Confusion technique. Confusion might be created by ambiguous words, complex or endless sentences, or transderivational searches. So a transderivational search, a psychological and cybernetics term, meaning when a search is being conducted for a fuzzy match across a broad field. So it's dealing with ambiguity. Unlike usual searches which look for literal, exact, logical, or regular expression, transderivational search is a search for a possible meaning or possible match as part of communication, and without which an incoming communication cannot be made any sense of whatsoever. So in other words, a person has to take that step forward, try to figure out what you're saying before they can understand it, before they can respond. It is thus an internal part of processing language and part of attaching meaning to communication. So you're drawing the person in to find the meaning of what you're saying because what you're saying is too ambiguous. The psychological example of this is in Ericksonian hypnotherapy, where vague suggestions are used that the patient must process intensely in order to find their own meanings, thus ensuring that the practitioner does not intrude his own beliefs into the subject's inner world. Okay. I've got an example of this by somebody who is a proponent of NVC. So I'm taking a quote out of the Facebook thread that we had. Okay, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. I used to try to, so what he's saying is why he's using NVC, why he doesn't see a conflict with trivium, and why he started using it with the trivium. I used to try to start with showing evidence, presenting claims and conclusions, which people called your beliefs, and found resistance. As I would guess you might have, perhaps. You might identify this as them being deluded. So there's planting a seed. So we've got a perhaps in there as a pattern interruption. As I would guess you might have seen perhaps, pattern interruption, you might identify them as deluded. And I might agree that I have found it amazing that what occurs when I stop trying that method and when I switch to using these tactics, which I now promote.
These tactics, interesting
That's
word.
Right. Yeah. So by promoting these methods, I do not imply ever that this is the more correct way to proceed to communicate, but rather that I have seen evidence that these methods have been yielding me better results than my former procedures, and I invite you and others to try them out. I hope this wasn't confusing, and I hope that you can tell that I never wish to be more than literal, and I very much am promoting an abundant perspective regarding communication choices, which I respect, analyze, and measure constantly. So the question, have you ever had problems when communicating your evidence and conclusions to people, and they refuse to investigate your claims and seem to desire to remain within their own conclusions, which you and I might call a delusion? So if you break down the techniques and go through this, you can see where there's pattern interruptions, where there's overly worded sentences, and then there's a suggestion planted, you might find they're delusional. It's planting seeds in there, using weasel language, and extrapolating this rather than just
and this was actually this person communicating directly to me, and he was attempting to hypnotize me with NVC to go with his agreement or sales pitch with it.
That's right. And now when you pick up this technique, this is how you're getting agreement. All of a sudden your relationships are easier. You're not having these arguments anymore. But this is why. You're manipulating people. How is this authentic? How is this consistent with reality? So it is subverting the person's conscious processing. I mean, I could go, we had one transcript that you had in a telephone conversation, and I went through clause by clause and told you exactly what's going on. We could do that with this. Maybe we should, and we'll put it as a download.
Yeah, sure. You know what? And that was actually, let me just pull that up if I can remember who that was. That was actually a former MKUltra doctor that I had a conversation with, David E. Worcester.
So, and you can see the same techniques happening here. I mean, it ends off which you and I might call a delusion. So he's planting this in that if you don't agree with me, you're delusional. If somebody's not disagreeing with you, they're delusional. You might identify them as being deluded, right? And found resistance. So you can see that the intention behind using the technique is not about communicating. It's not about consistency with reality. It's not about having better logic. It's not about having more complete grammar. The sole purpose behind this use is to get other people to adopt your view. Okay? Anytime I've seen somebody as a proponent of NVC, it's always come down to that. It has had nothing to do with reality. It has nothing to do with truth. It has nothing to do with communicating better. It has to do with getting people to agree with you. Okay? That's at the core of this. All right, so NVC, I'm going to go to slide 42 now. NVC was created by Marshall Rosenberg, a psychologist who has worked in conflict resolution and education reform. So I'll read a bit of a quote here about him. The Center for Nonviolent Communication emerged from work Rosenberg was doing with civil rights activists. Make note of that. In the early 1960s. During this period, he provided mediation and communication skills training to communities working to desegregated schools and other public institutions. And NVC is still taught through the activist communities right now, whether it's poverty or environment or whatever. It's still a core training method taught through activist communities. Rosenberg borrows the phrase dominator culture from Riane Eisler and builds upon Walter Wink's theory that we have lived under a domination culture paradigm for about 8,000 years. Walter Wink is a pastor of some sort that's written a number of books on dominator culture, but the primary source of dominator culture is Riane Eisler. Rosenberg says that this culture utilizes a specialized language and system of education to allow a small majority to rule over the vast majority of the people, so that the majority is not serving their own life needs, but serving their masters. So they're saying it's a tactic of authoritarian control, that language itself and education, which we all know are tactics, is there to propagate a civilization under authoritarian rule. Okay. Now I'm going to go over to Eisler. I'm not going to read the whole slide. So Riane Eisler, on her bio, says that she's a systems scientist, which goes back into cybernetics. She studied feminist studies. She has a law degree, studied at UC California, Santa Cruz, which is also where Bateson taught. She's gone back through history and essentially looked at it through a feminist lens. And then created a theory that essentially I think the current idea of big P patriarchy rests upon. Yep.
I just made a discovery. Somebody else who is also at UC Santa Cruz, drum roll, Richard Bandler.
There you go. So we're right back into the inner circle, the core circle. So we've got here, Eisler proposes that the new conceptual social categories and paradigms are needed which transcend conventional ones, such as sacred versus secular, right versus left, capitalism versus communism, east versus west, industrial versus pre or post-industrial, which she notes do not describe the whole of society's beliefs and institutions. So she's talking about social frames here. She points out that societies in all these categories have been repressive and violent, and that the roadmap to a more equitable and less violent social structure requires a new social frame, and describes social features that are ignored or marginalized in conventional analysis, particularly the social construct of the foundational parent-child and gender relations. Okay, so this is a justification for an attack on the family at its core, and the idea that dominate cultures, they're not only dominator cultures, they're male-specific. Masculinity is violent, masculinity is dominant.
So what you're saying then, Bill, is that they're using these dominating tactics to subvert the dominant culture to become dominant themselves. If
you follow through some of her articles and some of her recommendations, because she's active everywhere, and I think we mentioned this earlier. She's active in the Club of Rome. She's at UNESCO, in the UN.
She's active in Nyingma Budapest.
Yeah, and she fights, and some of them are very good cause, like fights for women's rights in third world countries where there are real women's issues that need to be dealt with. But if you look at what she's saying that turning to a caring culture that values essentially what our culture connotates with femininity is going to release us out of this authoritarian dominator control. But when you look at her recommendations, they're all top down. They all come from authority.
And not only that, but if you destroy the family, then what you're left with is communism to maintain the family, or to maintain any form of structure, which would be Huxley's Brave New World with babies coming out of test tubes, and the government is their parents.
That's right. So this woman's ideas are right at the core of many things. They stem out into anarchists up here, the black bloc. They go into poverty movements. They go into environmentalism. It goes into feminism. It goes into education. It spiders out from here. So all very good causes, all worthy causes, things that should be addressed. But if you look at the core of it, it has meta messages here. Masculinity is bad. Root of social problems is males and men. The family structure itself is the core of what propagates this. So what are you left with when you tear apart the family structure? Who raises the kids? The state raises the kids. And the other foundation idea behind it is that it's interdependent. Society is built off interdependence, not individuals that then interact, and out of that interaction we spin out with institutions, but that everything about it is interdependent. Well, where are human rights in that? This all leads in to collective first, individual second. Society, common good first, individual second. It's an attack on the individual, an attack on Protestant work ethic. Okay, so I'll go on a little bit more here because it ties even more back into Bateson, and she does disagree on Bateson around his views on power, but you can see elements of his influence here. She coined the term dominator culture to describe a system of dominance hierarchy ultimately backed up by fear of force. One of the core components of this system of authoritarian rule in both the family and the state is the subordination of women. Whether in Nazi Germany, Khomeini's Iran, and earlier cultures where chronic violence and despotic rule were the norm. She analyzes the androcracy, meaning males, governance of social organizations dominated by males, of Indo-European and other societies, versus what she proposes was a partnership model, as distinct from matriarchy. For the social organization of Neolithic Europe and later Minoan civilizations. So Neolithic Europe, we're talking about archaic revival.
Neo-feudalism again, yep.
That's right. She provides cross-cultural examples of dominator-oriented cultures and their characteristic configurations in compared to partnership cultures. The dominator system has four mutually supporting core components: top-down control in both family and states or tribes, rigid male dominance, and with this, the devaluation by both men and women of anything stereotypically considered feminine, including care and giving. The acceptance, even idealization of violence is a means of imposing one's will on others, and the system of beliefs that presents this relation of domination or being dominated as inevitable and desirable. Okay.
While she
So
promotes
true.
a totally state-dominated society, and she's working with the Club of Rome
Yeah, and that's
and the
at the core of
CIA.
this. Yeah, this is at the core of these ideas is that we say, well, the system we have is flawed and it's exploitative and it's dominating and authoritarian. We're going to create a world of equality and equity. And the only way to create that equity in a social structure is through top-down totalitarian control. It's a massive contradiction
Yeah.
in any of this that you find. It's a massive contradiction. So you have to start saying, okay, if the logical outcome of this idea, because you got to test ideas not on the promises they keep, but on in how their practical outcome comes. That if we're going to create a world, no authoritarian control, equity and equality, how is that equity and equality going to happen when somebody's taller and faster or somebody's smarter and brighter? The only way to do that is to regulate equality. It's top-down control.
And even birth through things like Huxley's test tubes in New World in Brave New World again. So we're right back to Huxley's material.
Yeah, and these arguments lead straight back into the idea that any social injustice in the world is if you don't go down the road of it being male. But what perpetuates social injustice in the world is the family. My kids are good. They know what equality is. They're not racist. They're not this. But they might go to school and pick up ideas off those other people's kids, right? So it's that the only thing that keeps social injustice going are the values passed on from the parents to the kids. Therefore, we need to remove or lessen the parental influence. So up here in Canada, this idea is in our school board as an idea called co-parenting. That the school co-parents the child with the parents. So something goes wrong with your kid at school, they don't tell you, they address it under the idea that they're co-parenting. So this is already in play. They're screwing with our kids right now. And this is the logic that they follow to come to that. The family is at the root of fascism. It's at the root of authoritarianism. It's at the root of social injustice. We need to dismantle the family.
Meanwhile, every authoritarian tyrant since the early Chinese empires has attempted to destroy the family to undo this. I mean, look at communist China and Mao. He wiped out families and just put families and children on opposite sides of the country and all of this stuff. And yet China is one of the most dominating cultures out there. So, I mean, like you said, it's all one huge contradiction. You know, Aldous Huxley lived in a world of dissociative disorder where his body was separate from his mind. These people are crazy. Rianne Eisler is clearly crazy.
But this goes back again that she's starting off with a premise. That she's starting off with a feminist premise. She's going to look at history through gender dynamics, as opposed to looking at the facts and then what rises out of that. So if you're going in with this a priori definition, it's like doing research with a magnet. You just throw the magnet over and whatever sticks to it, that becomes your theory and your evidence. And that's not how you think.
And I've done 2 episodes with Karen Strouhan from Girl Writes What, exposing feminism as socialism and all of that. In fact, the episode is Feminism, Socialism, and Sheep's Clothing. So
yeah. And this is only one part of it, because this ties back into the environmental movement. Like I said, it goes through across the board. This is getting right to the seed of where all these ideas are coming from. I've got a brief bio of her here. She's born in 1931, is a scholar, writer, feminist, and social activist. She was born in Vienna, and her family fled the Nazis to Cuba when she was a child, and she later immigrated to the United States, has degrees in sociology and law from the University of California. She's been described as a cultural historian, an evolutionary theorist, and a second-wave feminist. She's the founding member of the General Evolution Research Group, which is part of the Darwin Project, which is tied to the Club of Budapest. People can look that up in the brain. She's also a fellow of the World Academy of Arts and Science, Business Academy, and a member of the Club of Rome. She's an associate member of the Club of Rome. So she's right in the middle of this. She was one of the signers of the Humanist Manifesto. So now we're going into transhumanism and everything else. We're getting right at sort of the center of activities that are happening today.
She was a signer of the Humanist Manifesto.
Yeah, she was one of the signers of the Humanist Manifesto.
All right, as was John Dewey, who manipulated the same education system.
That's right. And we've got some research in the database about her husband, who's tying chaos theory with psychology. He ties back into cybernetics. He goes back to the New School for Social Research, which again goes back. Who else did we find there? We found.
We got Hans Eisler, John Cage, Leo Strauss, Margaret Mead, whose husband, of course, it was Gregory Bateson and helped create the CIA and MKUltra. Marlon Brando turns up there, as does Shimon Peres. We also have Harold Lasky. John Dewey is there again. John Maynard Keynes, Bob Carey, and Bertrand Russell. And, of course, last but not least, Eric Fromm.
Yeah. So we're right back into it. We're right back in. So, I mean, when you look at MKUltra, you have the psychologists over here. Then you have the counterculture people over here, and you don't have a direct connection up to what's going on today with the UN and globally. Now we've got a connection. This all stems. We're right at the center of it. This spiders out into what's going on today, what's gone on in the past. This is coherent. Okay.
So now we're beginning to understand the true maliciousness of nonviolent communication and neurolinguistic programming.
Yeah. Now that's only one layer when we talk about destruction of the family or usurping the family and so on, because it goes back down to that word I keep saying, interdependence. So as far as I can see, there are underlying assumptions with Eisler's work. Changes to avert dominator culture is through public and corporate policy. So anytime you look at what she's doing, she's talking about writing public policy and writing corporate policy.
So always top-down control.
Top-down. Always top-down.
Right.
Her arguments hinge on the idea of interdependence versus independence. So our needs are met through other people, that we are one cog in society. So society first, I'm interdependent within society. Okay? So this is a stolen concept, as opposed to the individual first, and through values of independence, self-reliance, personal responsibility, we then have a society built on a strong foundation. It's the other way around. So if you remove a strong foundation, what are you left with? You're left with a very weak social structure, one that's malleable.
Hence why they're attacking family and all of this to begin with.
Yeah. So these ideas spider out into a war on family as a dominator system, masculinity defined as dominator-focused, modernity, modern world based on classical liberal ideas of the individual, or industrialization, as a result of colonial dominator systems. So this is about anti-technology, anti-industry, return to the primitive. These ripples can be found in extremist views such as dismantling modern society, deep green resistance. Go look it up.
But wait, what is she suggesting but dismantling modern society? So again, she's completely out of her mind.
We need people to take out dams. We need people to knock out electrical infrastructures. We need people to protest and to chain themselves to trees. People taking out dams do not have a responsibility to ensure that people in homes previously powered by hydro know how to cook over a fire. They do, however, have a responsibility to support the people doing that work. Similarly, the people growing medicinal plants in preparation for the end of civilization do not have a responsibility to take out dams. They do, however, have a responsibility at the very least to not condemn those people who've chosen that work. In fact, they have a responsibility to support them. They especially have a responsibility to not report them to the cops. Do not fucking tell me that violence doesn't accomplish anything. It has systematically terrorized half of the population of human beings. And violence is dreadfully, dreadfully effective. Love does not imply pacifism.
Well, what happens is her core idea, her kernel of an idea, becomes the foundation for all these other ideas. So in the environmental movement, the root of all evil is industrialization and modern civilization. So instead of elevating people that are suffering and industrialize them, where we know population starts to decline, we know health issues start to decline and violence declines, let's get rid of industrialization altogether and make us all poor. We've got that. Culling the male population, Terence McKenna.
Okay, that's part of what the mushroom said, and I think it may seem radical in some circles, but not here, perhaps. It also said something else, which I rarely mention, but since you brought it up, there are not only too many people, there are too many men. And I would be very interested in seeing a set of social policies, tax incentives, medical policies, insurance policies put in place to limit male birth. This is the way to feminize the human race. If you're serious, this is the way to advance women. If you're serious, then what you have is less men, women whose dedication to the reproductive activities is confined in time to the amount of time it takes to raise only one child. This would be tremendously salutary to our problems. I've never heard it advocated, even by the most radical lesbian feminist yada yada. I've never heard anyone say male birth should be limited, but it obviously should, and through amniocentesis and this sort of thing, we can steer ourselves toward a population with the predominance of females, and those females should have only one child, and 75% of those children should also be female. This would seem, and I don't consider myself a gung-ho feminist. I mean, I'm a feminist, but I don't read the literature or try to understand all the factions and theories. As a humanist, I advocate a reduction in male births. It just seems obvious that that's the way to go.
Males, fathers are at the root of dominator systems. So you won't find her saying get rid of males, but this is the kernel idea. This is the a priori definition, the assumption that all of these other ideas are built upon. The dissolution of private property, or property is theft. The same thing.
The partnership situation would be democratic.
Yes.
Sure.
And of course the other autocratic.
Yes, that's
And
right.
autarkic.
And the financial infrastructure would be, one would be laissez-faire private ownership, the other would be shared.
Well, there would be degrees,
You
and
might say capitalism and socialism, you know? Maybe
Well,
oversimplified, but that's what it gets down to.
it's somewhat oversimplified, but certainly a more equitable, distribution of wealth, wouldn't you say?
And an abandonment of the notion of private property.
If we're interdependent, how can I own something that you don't own?
And of course, the right to property begins with the self.
Myself is my first property.
This is my hand. So
This
they
is
want
mine.
you to think, well, no, the state owns your hand, so it's not yours.
Yeah.
So
And
we can do whatever with you that we wish. Then talk about true dominator psychopathic society, and of course, the Bolsheviks in Russia murdered more than 60 million people to create their, equalist, their whole. Communist society, their utopia. So they had to murder everyone to accomplish it. I mean, it just goes from bad to worse with these people.
Yeah, and it goes back to that core idea that this equality has to be top down. What is the concrete, the percept that spins out into the idea of self-ownership? What do you think that is?
I don't know.
It gets overlooked because people say, well, natural rights, and then they become natural law, becomes this reified idea. If my hand is moving, I'm moving it. It's my volition. I am
Right.
the agent of this body. That's why this body's mine. If this body was yours, you would be moving it around. So if I can usurp your decision-making, your cognition, your free will, I no longer own myself. If I'm not an independent individual, I'm an interdependent individual in society, or an interdependent cog in society. What I'm relinquishing by my choice, it's the only way I can relinquish my own free will is by choice. What I'm relinquishing in that is the core of who I am. I'm giving up my free will on the foundation that, well, yeah, you know, it's right. I am affected by other people, and I wouldn't have this knowledge if I didn't have teachers and all that. It ignores the fact that you are the one who controls your body. Therefore, the consequences in the world are a result of your actions in your being here, which goes to personal responsibility. If you can turn that on the head, you have a bunch of people operating from an assumption that they're powerless and they're nothing but the result of the good things you tell them. Okay, and then the last thing that this comes down to is the idea of democratic truth. And if I've ever heard a strange argument against the trivium, it's the idea that it's in the democracy of ideas, it's totalitarian, because there's only one truth, and that truth is based on reality. So it flies in the face of the idea of a fair and equitable society to have something like the trivium or critical thinking, because it's undemocratic. So this, again, goes back to the idea that reality is based in consensus. So the next slide. I have a syllogism here that's quite long, which is how these ideas, dominator culture, leads into NVC. Okay? All human behavior is an attempt to fulfill needs. All human needs are universal, therefore they're never in conflict. Conflict rises from competing strategies for meeting needs. Violence is a strategy for meeting needs. Violence is learned culturally, so enter cybernetics. Colonial structures are dominator cultures based in violence. Dominator cultures use coercive language to enslave. The enslaved perpetuate the masters by the use of that language. Changing the language changes the culture from dominator to partner. So here's the thing. Are these premises true? How do we know if they're true? How can we falsify? How can we vet and ensure that they're true? Are they rooted in reality?
The funniest one is dominator cultures use coercive language to enslave. Well, what is NVC and NLP but coercive language?
Language. That's right. So again, what this goes down to, we have a whole bunch of ideas that spin off of a core assumption that somebody has defined a priori and then applied it to history, applied it to observations in reality. She who controls the definitions dictates the dialectic. I don't need to give you a logic or tell you what to think if I control the definitions. If I control the definitions, you will naturally come to my conclusion. And that's what's happening here. Okay. So we had charts in the last presentation that went from axioms, precepts, concepts, and so on. Right. This is the next slide, by the way. So I'm going to show how these ideas stack up against that. Are we building out of reality into higher level concepts and these concepts valid, or are we not? Okay, so again, we'll start off. We start off with reality. Then we have perception of reality, right, or percepts. So we've gone from the axiom of reality to the percepts, perception and consciousness of reality. Then we move into language. So now we're moving into an abstraction here. Language, communication of percepts. So we're communicating what we observe in reality. So language. Then out of language, perception, conscious, higher order concepts which depend on the development of language. So we move into concepts like society or friendship or love or whatever that are dependent upon our interactions, our relationship, and the language that we use. And then we can build even higher level concepts out of that, which only exist in the state of language alone, but eventually can be broken down back to percepts. So we can say that cybernetics is a real interaction. And cybernetics is basically this. I take an action, and that affects you. Then you take an action, which then affects me. So there is no independent action. Our actions affect each other. And at a lot of levels, that's true. But is that the axiomatic? Is that at the level of a percept? Or is it a higher order concept that has a dependency on all of these other things? Right? And if we're not keeping an eye on these dependencies, we get the following, which the axiom is language and cognition as perceptual frames. So language dictates the frame. We move up to percepts. Social interaction impacts the individual. So we've started off with social frames. Now social interactions impact the individual. Then we move up a level. Perceptual frames create personal experience. It creates my personal reality, which then construction of that experience is my personal reality. So we've gone from this idea that linguistics is where we start, then we move through from the broad to the concrete and say that reality is a result of my conscious experience, which is dependent upon social interaction, which is based upon frames in language, cultural frames. So we've turned the entire thing on its head. And people study this at the level of master's and doctorate degrees and buy it. Right? And they're the ones that are going out being bureaucrats and advisors in our governments and in our NGOs, creating a world or engineering a world they see fit because they think they know what's best for us. And these people can't even think through simple thoughts on their own. Anyways, it's my rant. It's social engineering. Okay. All right. So I'll go on to the next one. And this is kind of an introduction. People can go off and look for things on their own. NVC is common in activist training. Both Rosenberg, Walter Wink, and Eisler were both activists. They're all activists, social justice activists. The connection between the idea that modern culture is the root of all social injustice are pervasive throughout housing, poverty, indigenous rights, educational reform, and environmental activist circles. So they can maybe look at Greg Renouff's work and stuff like that, where they can see where these ideas are coming up and how there's carryover and how there's common players and lifetime activists that are kind of manipulating, people with legitimate causes and legitimate passions. But it's too much to go into here. NVC ideas have a tight orbit in a constellation of ideas which inevitably lead to the dismantling of industrial society in the name of social justice and sustainability. And it can only be implemented through a domination system with near absolute authority. So you tell me, can we modify NVC and call it voluntary communication?
Hell no. And no doubt the promoters of NVC are working hard right now to alter what they are doing to tackle the trivium method, quote unquote, problem. But the trivium method just is. You don't sit here and see us manipulating it every time one of these NVC promoters comes out. We use the trivium, dismantle their work, and then they pull back, regroup, and then not launch the next level of garbage at the trivium.
Yeah. So for me, this video is more. It's less about tearing down, and it is about that too, tearing down NVC and stuff. It's more of a call to people that are into the trivium, that are going to be watching this video, to do your due diligence. Really think through stuff. Master this stuff. Because even with it in hand, you've got this gold thing in your hand that gives a sense of security, that if I apply the trivium, I'm not going to be fooled, I'm not going to be manipulated. Then within the community that's promoting the trivium, you're being manipulated.
Right.
So it's not for you and me to teach people how to use the trivium or get up and say, you've got to use the trivium. This is a wake-up call to say, if you're going to focus your efforts somewhere, focus it on the trivium method. Right, really,
and a pure form of it, not all of this stuff. I mean, I must have seen 5 or 6 different corruptions of the trivium come out in the last 2 or 3 years, where they are just blatantly spinning it to sell veganism, to sell nonviolent communication, to sell the UN Agendas 21 and all of this stuff, to sell different New Age spiritualist ideas. I mean, I've seen, it's unbelievable how these people have spun this stuff, and then they'll come back at you and say, well, I am using the trivium. No, they're not. Absolutely not.
Yeah. And then the people that follow it see the trivium at play and see the application of it, but they don't see the underlying assumption. They don't see the premises that these are resting on.
Right,
so you can take somebody that's going, New Age spirituality is crap, but then they present you an alternate idea that is the exact same structure of concepts that are based on assumptions like occult has power, occult has the answers, these you're being cajoled to worship Satan without realizing it, which is just to say that Satanism is somehow powerful. You're being led down paths because of assumptions that you're not recognizing. My opinion. People are going to disagree with it. You do whatever you're going to do. It's not my business. But there are corruptions throughout this method. And we got to be thinking clearly if we're going to actually make changes in the world, especially if you have kids, because it's about my daughter. It's not about you.
And they've been using and corrupting this stuff for, at least a couple thousand years, apparently. And, the classical trivium is and has been always about social control and controlling the population. So, we've been putting out the trivium method since October of 2009, starting with Gino Dinning and episode number 49 of my show. And, except for the Christian version of the trivium, there wasn't really anything out there before that. And what we see today is all of these people realizing the threat that the trivium method really is to them, and then them using all of these social relations, NVC techniques, etc., to then thwart the trivium method and confuse everyone trying to study it and get it back into their ball court.
Yeah, I mean, if you have a framework that you're teaching that's based utterly on nonsense, and you're teaching it to people that have no critical thinking skills, and somebody stands up and say you're speaking out your rear end, learning the trivium is going to be an important thing for you, because then you can fight that argument. I can have an argument against that, and at that point, now you've got other people that are saying, well, wow, it's not only great stuff that I really never heard before and I agree with, it's got all this logic that backs it up. But again, who controls the definitions controls the logic. Check your grammar. Are those assumptions correct? Are they in reality? More importantly, can you verify them for yourself? If somebody's saying to you that you've been manipulated because the occulted knowledge has been what's been manipulating all this time, let's de-occult it. And if you have that knowledge, you won't be manipulated. Well, you're operating on the assumption that the occulted knowledge has validity. Does it have validity? The only validity it has is that you believe in it. So when they present you that argument, what they've done, the underlying assumption, is that it is a valid idea. And it's not. You don't want to be manipulated by occulted knowledge? Don't believe in it. Trust your senses. Think it through. It has no power.
Unless you want to be a Satanist, don't study Satanism.
That's right. So I'm frustrated, and I was talking to you yesterday that it's like I'm kind of hands up, let people eat their cake, because I see some really valuable work being done, like the work that you're doing and the trivium alongside of it that is educational, and then I'm seeing people right at the periphery of it pecking it around and destroying it. And
I couldn't agree with you more on that. What were you going to say?
No, I'm just that it's an important thing to defend, which I normally wouldn't do.
All right, so why don't we hit this last slide that you've got here, number 51.
Got a couple here. So when you look through this, we're talking about building concepts, like abstractions that are much higher level. If we've traced through people that have formed connections where you can start to go, okay, well, this is kind of nefarious. But we've also taken a conceptual level, how these ideas tie together and how they frame together. And that's just as valid. And if you want to verify your evidence, you can do a chain of ideas. Does it line up? And you can take your evidence and also compare it against a chain of ideas. That will reveal intention. That will reveal a direction. So this is not just a connection of people, but also of ideas. And the connection of these ideas can be traced It can go back farther than this, but it can be traced back to around the age of Fabians. So if you want the same terms and the same logic, it goes back to the Fabians in the late 1800s. And it's worked its way all the way up to today, and things like Agenda 21 and ideas around sustainability and around all these activist groups that are going on. That is at the root of it, it's the destruction of the Protestant work ethic, it's the dismantling of modern civilization, it's a return to a feudal economy. It sounds strange to people when you say a return to feudal age. The return to feudal age is simply this: no property rights. It's the commons. It's not living in castles, right? It's simply once property rights are removed, where things can't be in your immediate possession. You know, I can own this, but I can't own the house I live in. That's a feudal system.
Everybody else living in a mud hut while the elites, stay in their castles and in their wealth, and they'll have their little sectioned off bubble city or whatever, and then they'll have their police and military, and then everyone else will be
lives on the commons.
Who's allowed to be alive at all will be the ultimate slave.
And how do you live on the commons in a feudal situation? You vow your loyalty and defense of whoever has the claim to that land. So the idea of returning to the feudal or return to the primitive or the archaic revival isn't some strange idea. It's simply this: the removal of property rights, the removal of individual rights.
Which includes your own body, your own volition.
That's right. So in the end, it is about centralizing power into a global government.
And that's not an appeal to fear, folks. Them's the facts. And just look at the information and stop, following these people that promote this garbage nonviolent communication. They're misleading you. And it's a road that leads down a very dangerous, destructive path that can only end in your slavery.
Yeah. At the end of the day, NVC is weaponized language, and it's meant to disarm minds and make free thinking impotent or regarded as violent. It's an attack on the individual. At the end of the day, it's an attack on the individual.
Well said, Bill. Did you have anything else you wanted to add to this episode?
No.
Well, so that's enough of that. Now I want to address the concerns that we've been dealing with over the past 2 days. And from my perspective, we sort of designed this weekend with the notion of showcasing Rian's thought, and I think we've done that very well. To put what I'm going to say this morning in context, I just want to briefly review the basis of her theory. It is quite simply that the absence of patriarchy does not imply matriarchy. The natural and most long-running form of human organization is what Rian has named partnership society. Partnership societies were the norm up until, pick a number, 4,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago. In any case, eventually falling with the fall of Minoan Crete to Mycenaean invaders around 1000 BC, and that set us into the era of dominator cultures, which she believes, and I agree with her, is a temporary, I won't say aberration, a temporary, necessary adaptation, but one that we can now move beyond. My Rian's approach is basically to say what happened, that there was partnership society, and then she's very insistent that there was a confluence of factors which caused the shift from the partnership society to the dominator culture. I, being cast more in the fanatical mode, prefer to think that there was one major cause, and that its adumbrations can be explicated by the methods of archaeology, good logic, and a little visionary imagining. And so I want to tell you the story this morning. Remember, I said yesterday the best idea will win. And if you want to do that kind of total revisioning of the position of human beings in the world, I think you have to take at first a deconstructionist approach and take away everything that impedes the construction of the new point of view.
Was there a connection between Terence or me and the CIA?
Psychedelic movement in general? Or?
I can't speak for the psychedelic movement in general, but I can definitively tell you that neither Terence nor I ever had anything to do with the CIA. If you're talking about the Central Intelligence Agency. Now, you might say, well, I could crack a joke and say, yes, well, we worked for the CIA, we worked for the Cosmic Intelligence Agency. But then some of your audience might misconstrue that.
Yeah.
So let me make it clear. He never worked for the CIA, and neither did I.
Do you know where this comes from? There's a specific talk he gave where he discusses agents. And
yes, I know where it comes from, and I will dissect that right now. He said in one talk, something casually about, well, I was working deep cover for a while and then they moved me into PR, right? And who the they are was never specified. But I can tell you who the they are because those remarks, Jan Irvin either wasn't paying attention or was taking them out of context or is just an idiot because the meaning of it is clear if you listen to the whole talk, and he is talking about he worked for the mushrooms, which he did understand, correctly or not, to be actually whether it was the mushrooms themselves or they were representative of an intelligent race that was controlling it, but he worked for the mushrooms. That was the they that he worked for, and he was deep cover. And that refers to the years when he was not in public, when he was actually in the basement growing mushrooms as furiously as he possibly could, distributing those. That's deep cover, right? Then he decided, well, this is not sustainable. Sooner or later, they're going to, catch up with me on this. So he decided to go into public relations, and he started talking about it a lot more, and that's when he became, the spokesman that he is. But he was working for the mushrooms, and for Jan to take this and construe it to mean that he was working for the CIA, I mean, it's a really tortured stretch that you have to make that connection, considering how it was the context. And also, I'm his brother, I think I know, and we were involved in all this stuff together quite deeply. I've been to Esalen many times. Does that make me working for the CIA? Jan seems to think that everybody with having anything to do with psychedelics who happened to pass through Esalen was all part of this big conspiracy. Well, that's just utter horseshit. All kinds of people pass through Esalen. That doesn't mean that they're all involved in some conspiracy. I mean, it's just unbelievable. It's just such sloppy thinking and uncritical thinking that I can't take it seriously. And when all this comes up, I just feel like, well, poor Jan. I mean, the guy needs to, adjust his medications or something. I don't know. He's seriously deluded.
Well, I appreciate you addressing it. I know that there are people who are curious about that, so I figured we'd at least acknowledge.
Yeah.